Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of the afternoon. I hope you had a nice, enjoyable lunch break, which is also a networking break, and that is something we all enjoy very much, particularly in gatherings of this kind. So I hope you had time to chat and meet and look at future projects with potential partners. We have a session now that is organized by the Swedish presidency of the Council of the European Union. And we will look at the need to prioritize when saving lives with limited resources. I will ask you, or I will invite you to ask questions throughout the session at some point, more or less in the middle of the session, and then also at the end. So our speakers will happily answer your questions. If you are joining us online, you are very welcome. We would love actually to hear from you and involve you in the discussion. So for that, you need to go to Slido, hashtag EHF2023, and then you need to look for the right room. This is the auditorium, and the right date today is the 21st. That will give you access to our conversation on Slido for this session. I think there's also a QR code, so that might be simpler than looking for the date and the place, just in case. You are also very welcome to use that hashtag EHF2023 to promote the event and relay some of the discussion and exchanges that are taking place on Twitter or on other social media, of course. And we will have this afternoon, as for most of the sessions, interpretation in French, English, and Spanish. So feel free to use the language that you feel most comfortable with. Finally, we have a graphist recorder with us, so we will have graphic recording of our session. We'll look at the progress of the graphic recording as we go through the session on a few occasions. So we're looking forward to seeing what that will look like and how our conversations are going to be interpreted. This issue of prioritization is an essential issue for the Swedish presidency. It is already taking place, of course, prioritization, but it needs to be done in the best possible way. And as humanitarian needs are exploding all over the world, and that means that increasing funds are needed. And this increasing demand for funds cannot be met only by donors. So yes, we do need to prioritize, but prioritization must be carried out the same way by everybody. And for the moment, while prioritization is taking place already, that's not the case. Crises and partners compete for attention. Life-threatening needs are sometimes not met. And the warnings that are sent about extreme conditions are often not heard. Of course, there are systems in place. There's the integrated phase classification, the humanitarian needs overviews and response plans, but they're not used consistently or in a comparable manner by all actors. And that leads, of course, to a very complex and intense competition, and that's not the idea. So with our speakers this afternoon, we will explore what already is done about prioritization, what can be done further, what can be done better. And we will see how prioritization can be improved in the sense that it can be made more informed, more transparent, and more accountable. To take part in this discussion, it's a pleasure to welcome Barry Andrews, member of the European Parliament, Vezal Abdullah, who's program coordinator for the Arab Women Organization of Jordan. We have also with us Juliet Parker, who's the director for the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance, known as ALNAP. Karin Jämtin, who's Director General of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and Dr. Christos Christou, who's the International President of MSF. Welcome to all of you. I did mention Slido a few minutes ago, and before we dive into the exchanges with our speakers, we're going to ask you, and that is also you people in the room, not just people online. So put out your phones, open Slido, connect to slido.com, and then connect to the EHF 2023 hashtag. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And we have a question for you so that maybe we can pick up on the points that you make in our conversation. Our question is, now it should come up on the screen here, but I hope it comes up on your Slido. Yes. Why does prioritization matter? Why should we worry about prioritization? So we're hoping to have a substantial word cloud. So we still need a bit of time. If you're online, of course, do already connect to Slido, and that will also allow you to be ready for questions later on. And if you're in the room, yes, I see quite a few people on their phone. So I'll give you a minute. Accountability. Accountability is still the most, clearly the most put forward proposal. Accountability, efficiency, effectiveness. Okay, efficiency, effectiveness, I suppose we can probably put those two more or less under the same hat. Okay, so efficiency was the winning word, with accountability and effectiveness very, very close behind. So maybe you can pick up on that as you make your introductory remarks. But Karin, from the point of view of donors, why does prioritization matter? I mean, we saw, efficiency here, accountability, effectiveness. Is that the same for donors?
It would, at least, it's the same for Sweden. For SIDA and for Sweden, it would be very the same with efficiency, accountability, effectiveness, impact, etc. But there is also a small word somewhere saying humanity. Humanity and really reaching and knowing that we reach the ones most in need is maybe would be the overarching headline for us using prioritization. I would like to say also that, I would like to start off by saying the evident. There are limited resources. There's been limited resources for many, many years for humanitarian aid in different ways for us all to support people most in need everywhere in the world. Thus, prioritization is done every day and everywhere and has been so for many, many years. But the funding gap is bigger than ever. Thus, prioritization is more needed than ever. Why are the funding gaps bigger than ever? It's because, of course, evidently also because of the COVID-19 struck the poorest the hardest. The climate crisis, we were reminded yesterday from the IPCC, but also from UNEP, around the climate crisis. And of course, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which has created humanitarian needs in Ukraine, but also spurred increased needs elsewhere as prices has gone up. But I would also like to start off by reminding us, when we all face all of these tremendous challenges, we always have to remember that the system is actually delivering. The humanitarian system is delivering, it's effective, it saves lives, and we all work and try to do our utmost to reach the ones most in need. Thus, it's a good foundation for all of us to discuss and talk and to better the systems, because we all want to do that. Prioritization is around effectivity, it says in the word cloud, efficiency, accountability. And prioritizing humanitarian action in a fair, informed, and transparent manner is a responsibility for all of us. And if we fail to do so and leave operations in we will leave operations in dire situations stubbornly underfinanced. That would represent a real failure of all of us to the systems and within the system. I would like also to underline that from a donor perspective, it's of course important with accountability towards beneficiaries or people in need, but it's also extremely important with accountability to our taxpayers. We need to be able to say to taxpayers in Sweden that with humanitarian resources from Sweden, the ones most in need in the world is actually reached. At CEDAW, we allocate our humanitarian resources based on a needs-based allocation model, building on the different data sources available to us on needs, risks, and vulnerability. And then one final point before I end this start of this panel. Effective prioritization depends on quality and comparability of our analysis and of our data. We must have needs analysis that identify the most severe needs in a comparable way across crises across the globe. We need response plans that take needs into account in an impartial and systematic way. And we must also have greater transparency around how partners and donors make difficult choices within as well as between crises. Prioritization at first sight might seem easy, but it is difficult and it requires that we work together and compare knowledge, increase our common understanding, and compare and share data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin. Compare and share, indeed, but at the same time, for the moment, Juliette, I'm turning to you for my next question. It seems that some of the world's most severe crises are clearly underfunded. They remain underfunded. Why do you think that is?
I mean, as Karin mentioned, the part of the story is that the needs are growing and that the funding isn't keeping pace with that change. And that's come up in many, many of the discussions yesterday and today in the forum. But there are a couple of other aspects as well that I think are worth pointing out. One is that the gaps in funding between the best and worst funded appeals is also growing. So between 2018, there was a difference of 86 percentage points between the least and best funded appeals, which increased to 172 percentage point gap in 2021. And we might reasonably expect, of course, that the Ukraine crisis will have further skewed that in 2022. The other trend that I think is quite important when we're considering prioritization is around the increasing concentration of resources in the humanitarian sector. So in 2021, 40% of all IHA went to only 5 countries: Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Sudan, with protracted and complex crises. But also the funding is also concentrating. It's coming predominantly from a small number of institutional donors. So 57% in 2021 of all IHA was provided by just 5 donors, of which the US is providing the largest amount. But there are even with these limited resources, there are choices that are being made about where to allocate them. And we found in our State of the Humanitarian System report research that there were 2 key drivers for this. The first was on the nature of different crisis types and how they compete for attention, which has a strong influence on aid flows. So in 2021, the majority of humanitarian funding went to protracted crises, but appeals for protracted conflicts generally fell short of what was needed, and the proportion at which they were funded was lower than for some sudden onset crises. So this could indicate donor and donor public fatigue with some of the more protracted crises, which we heard in interviews in relation to Yemen and Syria. But donor fatigue was also mentioned in relation to contexts hit by repeated sudden onset crises, such as Haiti. Also, slower onset crises related to food security and hunger also typically receive less attention unless there's the siren call of famine that is sounded. International attention and money typically come when places enter IPC 5, the famine, but more people actually die in IPC 3 and 4 due to lack of support and the long amount of time sitting in those phases of acute hunger. There are exceptions to this, and one of the notable exceptions was the action on Somalia in 2017, which was faster, we think, partially due to the memories and political will of those involved in the failings of 2011, but also because there were fewer competing crises during that period. And we've not seen the same speed to act in this current period, with famine again looming large. The second driver, just very quickly, is the politics within and between countries has an effect on who gives funding and where it's allocated to. When there's such a small number of donors representing the bulk of international humanitarian assistance, the politics of donor countries can have a strong effect on how much humanitarian aid is provided and where it goes to. And there's a few examples of this. For example, around domestic counterterrorism laws that were challenging for assistance reaching people who needed it in rebel-held areas of Somalia and Syria. Public opinion, of course, and the sense of that domestic populations have about their proximity to people in need makes a difference when we see high Western support to those affected by the war in Ukraine. Also, the pressure on donors around domestic needs when there's economic challenges at home, for example, we've seen. And also the use of ODI to support refugee hosting in donor countries also potentially decreases the available funding to address needs and vulnerabilities elsewhere. So, for example, we're expecting to see the effects of hosting Afghan and Ukrainian refugees on aid volumes to be evident in our next set of analysis with the State of the Humanitarian System report.
Thank you very much. Barry, I'll ask you the same question, actually. I mean, the funding needs are not met. There's competition between the various crises, competition for attention, of course. Juliet has already given us some elements as to why some crises remain underfunded. But from your point of view,
yeah, thank you. Well, I'm a member of the Development Committee in the European Parliament, and as such, I am a funder, but also an advocate, in that it falls to us to vote on the annual budget of the European Union and to negotiate within that our Development Committee objectives, which obviously include humanitarian funding. And we also will be involved in the renegotiation or the refixing of the multi-annual financial framework. That's a 7-year financial envelope that drives the European Union, and within that looking to see can we make changes. And during the course of 2022, as we prepared the 2023 budget, I pushed very hard for additional funding for humanitarian funding, full in the knowledge that the entire allocation had been spent from the 2022 allocation had been spent by June, and already I think 95% of the 23 allocation has already been spent because of the huge needs in Ukraine and the huge needs that are arising from the earthquake most recently. So we're constantly fighting this battle. What Juliet mentions about the difference between a conflict-based funding environment and one that is a sudden onset natural disaster is generally holds very true. Syria is a place where it's incredibly hard to raise private funding despite the dreadful situation that the people are having to endure. Ukraine has been much easier, however, to raise private funding. So, for example, in my home country in Ireland, the ICRC raised more than 50 million euro through individual donations, which were for the Ukraine crisis, but not specifically restricted in that way. Whereas normally we see the conflict-related crises very difficult to fund. So it's a slight difference that seems to have occurred in Ukraine, and I think then when we just pull back a little bit and look at the type of funding that's been donated to Ukraine, people assume it's for the cause of Ukraine rather than for the humanitarian response. And I have tried to raise this issue consistently, the idea of the humanitarian principles in the European Parliament, but it's not really well understood. And even at very high levels, when communications are made about the European Union support for Ukraine, there is some confusion around all of this. So it's a fairly exceptional situation. I will say that, you know, as Juliette has pointed out, there is a very always growing needs. And I think the question on the screen earlier about prioritization, efficiency comes up as the top word, but I noted limited resources, lack of funds, money issue, and they're an amalgamation of the same issue. So prioritization, unfortunately, as a politician, means elevating certain issues and relegating others. And in a humanitarian, life-saving issue, that's a really, really difficult exercise to carry out. And really difficult for those who are delivering services in the field. So it is a really important debate to have today, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. We've heard already that the issue of overwhelming needs and limited resources is absolutely crucial. But Christos, how do humanitarian organizations prioritize their work today?
How? Before I go there, I would like to reflect a little bit on what I've been hearing these last 2 days, and also what I've been reading these last few months, where it is important to understand also what consists a humanitarian crisis from now on and in the future, and where we can respond and have good outcomes rather than just being part of a noise. While at the same time, it is important to understand that there are other crises where we are involved that they need very strong political solutions, and maybe in these cases we may have to somehow step back. However, in all those areas and contexts where we are all interested these days and consist the humanitarian crisis, still we have to prioritize for several reasons, and not only for the reasons that were mentioned before. It's always a matter, it's part of how we do things, and especially for doctors, it's very clear we do that in our everyday life. When we triage the patients and we understand based on our capacity where we can respond and where we cannot respond. But the number one thing is to understand and assess the needs impartially. This impartial needs assessment is very important and needs always to be based on the medical data. And second, to me, it's quite clear that we need to prioritize life-saving activities. Before we start looking at the well-being or the dignity or the suffering alleviation, you need to maintain them in life. And life-saving activities they go together with the needs assessment, and then it's the most vulnerable that we have to start from and not end with, because it happens, yes. So we start providing humanitarian assistance, and we keep seeing as MSF that those that they are very difficult to access, those that they are somewhere left in a limbo or between the two state and non-state armed groups, or we have identified vulnerable groups everywhere, and the pandemic showed us also that there are neglected people and vulnerable groups, even in Brussels, in the nursing homes. So we need to start from them and not just finish in case we have an excess of resources with the most vulnerable. And that are the three key priorities for us. So impartial needs assessment, life-saving activities first, and then focus on the most vulnerable. How? And I will finish here. I understand it's not easy. Maybe we are privileged because thanks to the generosity of 7 million donors, we have this independence. But I would strongly advocate for this kind of independence to all the humanitarian activities and actions. We have to find ways to ensure that they independently assess these needs and impartially. And there is, maybe we'll bring this again to the discussion later, but there are some other new, let's say, trends these days that we need to be aware of and get better prepared. As Hubert said before, we need to understand that new humanitarian actors will come, and they want to have a role. We need to go back to the basics, to these principles that you mentioned. And these principles need to be reminded to all of us.
Thank you. Vezal, in your experience, are the prioritization criteria, if I can call them that, similar to what we've just heard from Christos?
Okay, thank you very much. For local women-led organizations, it's a bit different aspect. Let's say, because in general, women-led organizations are mission-driven organizations. So we don't really decide the priorities. We are in a direct contact with the local communities, with people in need. So we take these priorities that we have from the local communities and build on that with a constant assessment for needs and how to respond to the needs. So then we respond to those needs from people, from women and girls on the ground in different contexts. And this response be with the support of different donors. So when we want to think about prioritization and how to work and to be more effective in responding to the needs, we really need to build the balance again between the best value of money and the best value, the best use of money principle, and how can we use the low resources to do more effective respond. This is one thing. The other thing is when we talk about women-led organizations or local organizations, we talk about more outreach and more effective reach, because women-led organizations in specific are from within the community. So they are living day by day with those most affected populations. So now we really need to talk about also shifting the power to local actors. When we shift the power, we will find that shifting the power with taking into consideration, as I said, best use of money principle, we will be delivering more effective, let's say, for example, services, more effective response to affected population. And I really want to highlight one example of the Arab Women Organization of Jordan's work. We have a project in partnership with Care USA, and we are sub-grantees as the usual as the usual role. And then when we started to implement this project based on the needs assessment and needs analysis from Jordan and the MENA region, we started to implement these activities based on the real needs that we had. And then we applied for another fund from the Swiss government, and they took this courageous step to fund directly AWO, and AWO was able to sub-grant Care USA. So it was one of a kind and innovative approach to work. And I will talk in percentage. When we have the direct fund, we were able to spend 76% of the fund on the activity directly, and 24% were for the overhead plus personnel. And when we were sub-grantees with Care USA, we were able only to have 60% for activities and 40% for overhead and personnel. So here we can see the best value of money or best use of money that local actors and local respondents can use. And like, we cannot say that we will be having more fund or more money. I know that we're not like in the world, we're not in the best situation now economically, but if we start to use what we have in a better way, we will be able to respond better and to really save lives and to continue working in the humanitarian settings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal. I'll now open the floor to you for a first round of questions. So I have to put on my glasses to make sure I see where the hands are. Now's your chance. Somebody has to open the floor. Oh, yes. We have a hand back up there. Yes, the mic's being brought to you.
Thank you. I'm Vincent Staley. I'm the Operations Director of ACF. I wanted to go into what Juliette was mentioning. We all know that the global funding is not reaching the levels we want to, but the differences between the different funding levels of different crises is something that I think we should look at. And maybe, as Christoph said, I mean, our aim is saving lives in the humanitarian sector, so maybe this could be used as a criteria to reshuffle in case we see that some funding is some countries are overfunded, which is very rare, or maybe to see what levels we could also exchange between some of the crises. I don't know how the panel sees this.
Who would like to chip in first? Maybe Karin?
Important question, to say the least. I suppose all countries have their own models and their own efforts and tries to reach where you were in the direction that you were aiming, and that we have, I think all of us have touched upon. I would like to say something about our model and how we worked. Last year, a war struck in Europe, 2 hours flight from Stockholm, and we were, of course, very deeply involved in trying to support the Ukrainian people, both when they fled to our country, but also with humanitarian aid for people who choose to or who needed to stay in the country. As I said before, we have a model in Sweden at SIDA where we have 2 models in Sweden. The one is that the government provides core support to UN system, but also other humanitarian actors. That's an annual core support, and it's very, very flexible, and it's up to them to prioritize in line of this core support. But at SIDA, we allocate the annual allocations, actually the majority of the Swedish humanitarian aid, according to our model. When we allocated this year's support to countries, to geography, Ukraine is our 6th largest crisis. It's not the largest crisis. There are 5 crises before Ukraine. And that is, of course, because of Syria, Afghanistan, Sahel, and others being more severe when it came to assessing needs and people most in need. There are many ways of doing this, but our model is one model, and we would be very happy to continue dialogue on having similar models amongst more donors, actually.
Thank you, Karin. Christos, yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we should not shy away from that. And I will put it very frankly here now, because, before I mentioned how we choose where to go and where not to go. And in a few of the places, we found ourselves alone there these days, and there's no one. There's no one in northwest Nigeria this day that kids fly. They die like flies. There's no one in some of the areas in the conflict between the Anglophone and the Francophone Cameroon. And there are quite very few actors in other places that nobody speaks about. Then there's no one in Haiti, and we don't speak that much about Haiti. So these are crises that, the humanitarians will need to bring them more in forward, and try to remind somehow that, okay, with all these funds that we have, they're not enough. With all the resources, with all this capacity, let's start doing this more proportionally. And it's not what I see these days. Your numbers, my numbers also say that Ukraine has more than 2 billion only the last year of funds, while this is much, much more than what all other places that I just mentioned before have together. And I see how donors ask from all of you to allocate your resources in only some places, like Ukraine. And I would like this to be the case for every other of these forgotten crises. So that's exactly the question. And we need to push also all the donors, all the countries, to understand, to sensitize them more with what is happening in other sides of the world.
Thank you. Would one of you like to add something? Yes, Barry, please.
Yeah, I just got off a plane from Nigeria this morning, and Christos is right there. It is very neglected, the situation in northwest Nigeria. I was there on election observation mission, but there was an absolute lack of understanding. I just want to add one point, which is the problem of layering geopolitical considerations on top of humanitarian crises. And I kind of hinted at this, I suppose, in my opening comments, that Ukraine attracts enormous attention because it layered upon a key geopolitical strategic objective of the European Union. Compared to Afghanistan, where the West has more or less turned its back on Afghanistan, and there is no longer any upside from a geopolitical point of view. I mean, I understand there's still funding there, but there is nothing like the attention that's given. And the problem with layering geopolitical objectives on the humanitarian crisis is it completely skews the humanitarian principles, and it causes these kinds of problems. And I've been working on the trying to draw attention back to Afghanistan because of the enormous humanitarian crisis. The European Council has imposed 5 benchmarks that the Taliban, the Afghan government, has to satisfy before full funding can be restored. And they're completely unrealistic sets of objectives for a country that is so reliant on the aid that we give them. So there's, I think, I'm always working on this in the Parliament, in my group, in my committee, to try and separate the humanitarian from the political, and it's difficult. It really is. I just want to add one more point: is that to respond to your very interesting example in relation to your relationship with CARE, in that you have shifted from being a sub-grantee to being the main holder of the grant, and delivered better impact by your calculation. And that's a really wonderful thing. But from when I was in NGOs a long time, well, only a few years back, the risk with granting directly was around governance and compliance and all of this. So I'd love to hear, how that has changed. And donors, of course, have to share the risk around the implications of localization. And again, that's a really difficult. Well, it's an important thing we need to talk about. So I'll hand back then. Thanks.
Thank you. We have another question over there. I'd like to take it maybe in the second round, but just first, Arnest, make it short, if you don't mind, and then I'll read what we have received on Slido as well.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Erika Velosa. I'm from Colombia, and I lead an NGO there working in humanitarian action. And I would like to highlight 2 questions. The first one is the system, of course, needs financial, and the system needs different steps and different kind of organizations for working. In the first line of the responses, normally there are a lot of communitarian responses that are not financial by no one. In our experience, the people who is in the front line are looking the money of the community, the solidarity of the community, and that is the first response. And normally it's not the response financial by the big system of humanitarian action. And then there is a lot of things related with where is the money exactly in each part, and that is my second point. And I have listened the 2 days about ethical financial support, no? And how is the most correct way to handle the risk. In the middle of the donors and the frontline organizations, normally there are other organizations that assume the risk. But I would like to say that in the front line, the risk that is not covered is not only about the results, it's about the resources of the humanitarian people who is in the front, the burnout that sometimes they have, the risks that security that sometimes they assume, and that risks are not covered by the financial support. And other thing that is important
I'm sorry,
there,
but
just
please,
one sec.
we need to come to the end of.
Yes, thank you. It's the idea that this front line that is covered maybe have the 7% of overhead for all the financial support, and the intermediate financial is 24 or more. That is not having all the risk that the first line have. What we could do for exchanging that chain of power and to have more ethical care about all the risks that are involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask, I give all of you a few seconds to think about that, and you can tell me who would like to answer, but I'd like to come to what we have received over Slido. First of all, we got a comment. How do you overcome political popularity against needs? Ukraine and Turkey receiving funding and political visits when Yemen and Chad do not. So that was just a comment that we have received. And then we have two questions that are really related. So maybe I'll turn to Christos with those and then ask Vezal if you'd like to come up with that one or comments on that one. So those two questions are humanitarians making prioritization harder by overstretching their mandate and labeling every action as life-saving when a number aren't really? And the second question is, what about interagency competition? How does competition among UN agencies and major NGOs affect the prioritization process? So let's first answer to the question we got from the room. And who would like to pick up on that question? I was wondering, Karen, if you had some... Juliette?
Yes, I'm not, well, it's a tricky question, but maybe, can I just make a comment that I think relates to quite a few of these question areas, which is around the mandate. It's around the mandate of the humanitarian sector and about the mandate of humanitarian agencies within that. And I was struck by Christos' position. It's about the most vulnerable, and it's about the life-saving assistance is where the humanitarian sector should be focusing. But there's been lots of discussions this last 2 days about, kind of mission creep of the humanitarian sector and what the parameters of humanitarianism actually are. And I think it's really problematic. We're in a situation where we can see the sector cannot do what it wants to do and feels it needs to do with the resources that are available to it. It's not possible. And that but what we tend to do is we keep looking at how we need to reinvent our sector in order to be able to do it better. But there's been, I even saw the word nexus on the word cloud. One of our conclusions from our report is that actually what the sector needs is the ability and the humility to work with all the other actors that work in humanitarian action that aren't the humanitarian sector. And when we look back at our evaluations, this issue of linking relief and development has been coming up for years and years and years, and the recommendations still are almost the same as they were 20 years ago. And actually, whether it's local actors, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the development actors, it's come up so many times in the conversations this last 2 days about we know that we need to get better at working with them. We need to establish a common language. And a little bit like Karen was saying about, we need a common understanding of needs within the sector. We also need a common understanding of needs outside of the sector and an understanding of what we need to do collectively and collaboratively in order to adequately address them.
Mm-hmm. Vezal, would that... Does that trigger a comment from you or any of the questions we have there?
Yeah, I really hear and feel the first question, because yes, there's a lot of visits to certain areas, not to other areas. There's a lot of conflict around especially in the region where I'm coming from. But I want to comment on the two other questions, if you allow me. For the overstretching of the mandate, I think I will give another example, because Jordan, for example, is an affected country of the Syrian crisis and the Iraqi crisis and the Yemeni crisis, but we don't have a conflict inside the country. So we were facing some, like, we cannot give this fund because you don't have conflict. So do we need to have a conflict to be affected, or to be really in need into this fund, for example? So the when the title is a life saving, they connected it, some donors connected it to the crisis on the ground. But looking to the protracted Syrian crisis, for example, we still have Syrian refugees in Jordan. We still have massive numbers of GBV cases and SGBV cases. We still have massive numbers of like women killing and women's rights issues. So if we would say, like, let's be in the middle. Let's have the spirit of the words that we use. Let's have the flexibility to cover all aspects of response. And the last question is, yes, as a women-led organization representative, we are suffering from this kind of competition. We are in the same application with INGOs, with UN agencies. They have bigger capacities. They have a person for every job, we used to say, and they have the trust that is there with donors. And actually, it's very hard for local actors to compete to these opportunities in general, unless we have partnership with INGO or a UN agency. And that affect our resources and the effectiveness of the response on the ground.
Thank you. Yes, Christos.
Maybe I can also reflect, trying to address also a few of your points and questions that you mentioned. But I will insist that life saving should be the priority. However, I don't disagree with you, Juliet, that there are many other things that we need to bring closer there. I also think that Nexus, although MSF always were criticizing Nexus a lot, and we wanted to protect the humanitarian part of it, not to be co-opted in narratives that at the end of the day would not help neither development nor peace, and of course not the humanitarianism. But I just come back from Yemen. I was there for 20 days. I visited all our projects, and I was shocked to see that, of course, hopefully this war is over, but still there are so many needs that nobody speaks about. And I found myself becoming slowly the ambassador of Nexus when it comes to the absolute necessity, for example, to strengthen the primary healthcare centers there. And I realized that these people have not gotten any money, any incentives, nothing, no salaries. They are demotivated. They do not open their primary healthcare centers. I spoke to so many women that they had to travel long distances to find some help in an MSF premise. And I realized that the least that they need is something to oil this machine, to start. And those that they were supposed to be doing that, they don't do that. So I was there asking for people to get paid the salaries and incentives. So we are open to look at all this, but let us not just hide behind, all these old narratives, but put things in a very pragmatic way of what is happening in each one of the contexts. And my last point about the interagency competition, and of course the funds are such, we need to protect all these organizations to make them start thinking more independently, based on the needs, more impartially. And they don't. They have more and more the pressure of the donors, more and more the pressure of the report. They spend more and more time preparing reports instead of being on the ground. And I haven't seen many on the ground. We need more. We need also more senior people on the ground. And we need them to be liberated from all these obstacles in order to come with very interesting and innovative ideas. That's where the competition can help actually other NGOs as well, and especially mine. But we're not there yet. So that is another point that we need to think of. Thank you.
Thank you. And if, I mean, we're going to have another round of questions, so you will have more of a chance to also talk to our speakers. But Barry, we've heard that, and we keep hearing that, yes, we need to have prioritization that's based on more informed, transparent, and principled approach. And that applies to crises and in between crises as well. But now we've just heard other approaches, more cooperation between actors. It's not just something that's required, it's an actual need. How can we do that? I mean, you know, is there a political or a policy approach to help with that?
Yeah, I think it's really more a question for those that are working on the ground, but it does strike me that you know, we do talk about the nexus in our committee. We tried to draw attention to the. We did a report on humanitarian action last year in the Development Committee, and you know, we tried to draw attention to the need for cooperation with development actors, with local actors, and especially with the private sector. This is becoming more and more a debate on the development side about leveraging private sector investment, about blended finance. When we talk about the global gateway on the development side, it's around leveraging private sector investment in different ways in order to achieve development objectives. And this language is beginning to come into the humanitarian field much greater than had been the case before, so that there is definitely high levels of cooperation. And then I suppose you're confronted then, well, how do you manage to maintain the humanitarian principles with that interaction? And it is very difficult. I just want to go back to a couple of other points that are being raised. I mean, the interagency competition. I ran an NGO, and I think it's healthy. I think sometimes there's comparative advantage when a crisis emerges. There are some organizations that are better at leading, others that are better at cooperating with a lead organization. There are different needs in different crises. There are different geographies. There are different geopolitical situations, the context in which something takes place, and therefore there's just different risk appetite. I mean, MSF obviously has a very high risk appetite, others a low risk appetite. And so you end up with it looks like a kaleidoscope of different NGOs, but they each actually, we have a phrase in Ireland, there's a lid for every pot. And there's an NGO for every crisis, and there's a humanitarian response and a combination of humanitarian organizations for every crisis. So I don't really have a problem with interagency competition. I think sometimes it's healthy, and I think it also allows for innovative thinking, and it forces people to think about what's the better way to deliver their message, to deliver their service, and to run their organization. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
Thank you. Karin, how do we ensure a better prioritization if we look at the in-between crises phase?
Could I just comment on two other things before I answer that question?
Please do.
The first thing I would like to comment is what Barry said last, and that is, yes, competition can be healthy in any instance, also here. But when there is a competition, including mission creep sometimes, it's not healthy. Then it leads to, it's not only will lead to, it leads to agencies working in areas that they are not fit for, because they need to finance their own work. So as donors, we need to work more with core funding and flexible funding to make it possible for agencies to actually act effectively. On the Nexus side, I would like to comment one more thing, and that is, I think that the homework is more needed to be done in the development community. I'm heading an agency having both humanitarian aid and development cooperation under the frame of SIDA. And we are trying to make the development part of our agency, which is evidently the biggest part, work in new ways. Looking at risks in new ways, working more long-term in seemingly humanitarian settings. And I think that was one of the reasons, not only us, but also others doing it in Somalia, that was mentioned before. It was 2017, I think it was. We handled that situation slightly better than other crises before, and that was one of the reasons for that, was that development community came in earlier. There are very few places where there is a real discussion and where development people and humanitarian people really meet and discuss. I very much agree with what Juliet said before in that sense. Sorry for taking a lot of time on those 2 points, but I thought they were important. 4 points from my side to your question. The one was, which was, what do we need to do?
In between crises.
Yeah, exactly. 3 short points and then 1/4, a little bit longer point. Humanitarian needs analysis that are used for response planning and appeals must be transparent and identify the most severe needs in a comparable way. I've said it several times. In a comparable way across crises and times. Secondly, the severity of needs must be taken into consideration in a sufficiently comparable way, again comparable. Thirdly, humanitarian actors responding in a crisis must be transparent about the choices that they are forced to make due to limited resources. It makes it possible for us as donors to explain to taxpayers, but also in other senses to explain why severe choices have to be made, actually. My 4th point is that from the donor side, we have to work more with flexible, multi-annual quality funding. It's a way to ensure that humanitarian actors can prioritize strategically according to their knowledge and their views when the crisis strikes, and they have to act swiftly. So as donors, we have to work more with quality funding as well as provide more funding. That is my final point on your question. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick question to Juliet and Vezal, and I'll ask you to please make it a short answer so that we can hopefully take a couple final questions. But if we agree that we direct most funds at life-saving, what happens with the work on prevention and anticipation of crisis, which is also really necessary? Juliet.
Yes. So, I mean, anticipatory action and resilience are really important to humanitarian action. I mean, there's questions about who should be doing it, but the implications are really important. With anticipatory action, there's a growing body of evidence to support its effectiveness, and some really good pilots now with good outcome evidence in support of enabling people to meet crises on their own terms and to mitigate some of the worst impacts. And also, we know that anticipation and adaptation are core components of adapting humanitarian action to climate change, which is going to become increasingly important as well. And on resilience, the division between humanitarian and development functions, as we know, is one considered by the international system. It largely does not resonate with the people that we're trying to assist. And as crises are becoming increasingly protracted, a focus only on immediate life-saving doesn't fit the realities of many of the crisis-affected people either. And also, I mean, there's been some very stark examples this year from Syria and Turkey and Pakistan about, on resilience, about the lack of resilient infrastructure to flooding and earthquakes, creating significant humanitarian need itself. So it has to be taken as part of the humanitarian consideration. One other note that we identified as a risk also of this kind of hyper-prioritization is that it might also put us in tension with the system's commitment to people-centered aid. And it's only a risk that we've identified, but a shift to focus on only the most life-saving needs risks a reversion to a top-down imposition of what the system considers to be life-saving, with consultation being perceived as both a costly endeavor and one which might reveal a range of people's priorities which are at odds with what the system might be choosing to prioritize.
Thank you. Besal, from your point of view, what do we do with those which are also necessary steps to be taken?
Yeah, I think narrowing the focus to life-saving suggests that we don't want to change or to consider the change or changing the way we work as a humanitarian system, because we need to invest more. As I said before, we need to invest more in the cost efficiency more than to cut things off, let's say. We need to consider the chronic needs that result from narrowing the fund or narrowing the resources to life-saving, and the impact that will have both on people's dignity and the future cost of response. Because if we keep funding and resourcing only life-saving activities, and we will be having lack of resources to the results of ended conflicts maybe, or ended crisis. We will have more need to more resources in the future to cover the results of the previous crisis and conflicts. Because what we have now, and I'm talking about the region, the MENA region, for example. As I said, we have massively increasing numbers of GBV cases. And it's affecting the society, the communities, the lives of women and girls. And also there's a lot of neglecting of resources to women and girls in some areas. So if we will be having less resources to respond to that, we will be having protracted maybe not, and will not be able to control that new crisis, maybe not a humanitarian crisis, but it will be a crisis in the future. And I will take 30 seconds to answer Barry's question. It's equal partnership. If we have equal partnerships with international organizations, between international organizations and national and local actors, we can build evidence for the donors to be able to support, to break the lack of trust that exists between the two parties. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Christos, I'd like to take a final 2 questions from the room, and we'll group those 2 questions so that we can close on time. So do we have questions in the room? Yes. Okay, so we have one up there and one from the gentleman here. Up there on the left, if you go a little further on the left. Okay, please, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Reverend John from South Sudan. And thank you very much for the good presentation on the life-saving and the prioritization of aid. I would want to ask mainly to the donors, especially the Sweden and the Honorable from the Parliament. When we focus on the life-saving, which is very important for us, the aid workers, and leaving the main root cause of the crisis, where are we heading to? That's the first question, because I know European Union has a very instrumental role in terms of restoring peace so that life of the people live in dignity and a meaningful life. So where are we? Secondly, is partnership. When SIDA, ECO, USAID, GFFO, name them, DFID, they give funding to the big, maybe UN agencies and the big INGOs, and they sit in Europe. They don't see what is happening in the global south, where some villages are left without funding or prioritizations. What can we do to make a meaningful prioritization of response so that the aid reach to the people that are intended for the taxpayer money to be given to the right people? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. If you don't mind waiting, just so we'll take the other question. So the person who was asking the next question, I'm sorry, I cannot see you, so if you can stand up and ask your question. Yes. Go ahead, sir.
Oui, bonsoir. Alors, je suis Ismaël Semporé du Burkina Faso. Je viens au nom de...
Sorry, can you wait just a second to give time to our speakers to put on their headphones, because we wouldn't want them to miss part of your question.
Okay. Dr. Semporé Ismaël, from Burkina Faso.
Allez-y, allez-y.
OK, d'accord. Alors, c'est très intéressant qu'on entende parler de priorisation des financements. Et pour peut-être un peu ironiser, je me dirais que c'est la raison pour laquelle l'Afrique, particulièrement l'Afrique de l'Ouest, est moins financée. Et si c'est le cas, je penserais aussi que c'est une erreur parce qu'aujourd'hui, la crise qui sévit dans la région ouest africaine actuellement est autant, ou du moins est pire que ce qu'on croit penser de d'autres endroits du monde. Je prends l'exemple du Mali, qu'on n'a pas encore cité ici. L'exemple de mon propre pays, qu'on n'a pas encore cité ici. Et l'exemple même du Niger, qui est là. Et en témoin de la gravité, je vous dirais que rien que pour les personnes déplacées internes du Burkina Faso, ça avoisine les 2 millions, si ça ne dépasse pas. Et à mon sens, je n'ai vu aucun pays qui présente autant de chiffres. Donc, ce qui veut dire que les problèmes qui ont été soulevés ici, ils sont, et même peut-être pire, pour rejoindre un peu l'intervention du patron de ACF, il faudrait réellement qu'on recadre les choses. Les financements sont mobilisés, certes, mais est-ce que ça va réellement aux bénéficiaires? C'est une belle question aussi auquel on doit s'attarder. Et le plus souvent, l'aide aussi...
Je suis désolée, je suis obligée de vous interrompre.
Okay.
Il nous reste très très peu de temps pour répondre.
D'accord. Alors, une dernière question.
Rapide, s'il vous plaît.
Voilà, je vais demander à ceux qui interviennent à la fois et dans les autres contrées et en Afrique de nous faire une situation exacte afin qu'on puisse un peu s'orienter par rapport un peu aux appuis qu'on nous apporte, surtout nous, Africains. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. So, I'll let the interpreters finish. The first question maybe to Barry and Karin about the role of donors and how we can answer the request, making sure that the funding, the help reaches all parts.
Yeah, look, what occurred to me listening to the question from South Sudan was, trends just come and go in this area. When I was involved, the trend was towards bigger grants to less organizations, the formation of consortia, and that's the way it was in 2015, 2014. That can change very quickly. I think in South Sudan, you know, it's a very, very complex environment, and you know, the donors, when I was an agency, we were trying to push us into the development space, away from the humanitarian space, and that was tricky. But I just want to make one other point, just on you know, lessons learned from crises. And unfortunately, if you take the Ebola crisis, it was all about health systems strengthening. And can we say that we actually did that? Did we really move from crisis management to risk management? For all the talk of disaster risk reduction and preparedness and anticipatory action, when you look back on how ready we were for the global pandemic, I'm not sure we've really learned a lot of those lessons. So it's important that we really reflect on that. One final point. When David Cameron became Prime Minister, he was talking about the golden thread, democracy, the rule of law, and support. And I've just come back from Nigeria, where there was a very, very bad election, the most important democracy in Africa, and that has consequences. And so this is part of the overall collaboration that we have to have if we want to have better outcomes.
Thank you. Karin.
I'll be very brief. We only have a minute and a half. I share your worry. If we do not have as our overarching aim to work with the root causes, combat poverty, and work towards the Agenda 2030 and all of the 17 SDGs goals, then we will not lower poverty, nor will we meet the humanitarian needs in the world. So I really do share your worries. And we are trying to explain why long-term development cooperation has to be used to tackle the root causes for humanitarian challenges. But at the same time, there will always be humanitarian things happening. There will be floods. There are floods currently in Malawi, but also in Congo. There are immense challenges in many other countries in the world. Humanitarian life-saving work will be needed also in the future. So we have to do both. But root causes and long-term development cooperation has to be prioritized also in the future.
Thank you. Christos, would you like to take the question about West Africa, but I think it's more generally the underfunding of some crises, as we have talked about before, and also the fact that maybe there is a lack of information on some of the crises that are ongoing?
Yeah, it's a combination of things, and I very much stay in sympathy with what was said before. Actually, it is only a few weeks ago that we lost colleagues of ours in the conflict in Burkina Faso. Again, we've been in the middle of one of all these incidents that they are so often happening there. And I understand that for many, this risk appetite is the number one factor of choosing or not choosing to be in a place. And we have to respect that, because at the end of the day, what matters also is the life and the safety of those providing humanitarian aid. But there's also related to the fact that we don't share enough information about all these places and all these contexts. We need to do more. You see how news are dominated always by what is more trendy and what is attracting more interest, and we've seen that with Ukraine. So do we want to be part of this, or we can really do better? I think we can do better. And maybe just grabbing the opportunity, and I finish very quickly, one thing that we may have missed so far, emphasizing a lot, and it was only Wessa that mentioned that before, we see that in many places. We see that in Ukraine these days. We see that in Haiti. We have wonderful, brilliant civil society organizations and communities. We started engaging with communities over a long journey of 40 years, and we realized that that's the only way that we can work. We learned this lesson from Ebola, and we made sure that that we will not repeat the same mistakes in the pandemic as others. But the communities are there. They are first. They are there before any one of us arrives, and they will stay even when everyone leaves. And they have the capacity to respond to places where nobody else has access. I've seen that in all these temporarily occupied territories in Ukraine, and that's how we are working. So these are new ways to think of, and we have to emphasize a lot on their role. And of course, being more prepared between the crises. We need to develop more this emergency response capacity, and there are ideas also there. But sorry, I took longer.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Christos. So, and it was a nice way of closing the discussion on a positive note about more cooperation. So I think that sort of sums up large part of what has been discussed this afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this particular session, and I'd like you to thank our speakers for being with us this afternoon. I'd like also to thank our graphic artist, because you have been following. For us, we only had it on the screen there. That's why sometimes you could see us. But she's done an excellent job of summarizing our discussion. Thank you very much. And thanks, of course, to our interpreters for accompanying us. Have a very nice afternoon. We now have a half-hour coffee break, and then more breakout sessions for the late afternoon. Thank you.